I'd like to get started with the history of pathology and a bit of microbiology and how concepts of health and disease have changed. I'd like to really thank Atlas Club for their continuing efforts to organize this, and especially Path Club and Wilderness Medicine for hosting this and making sure that we're not all starving in the process. So let's get started. Those of you who are at the first talk, we're going to do a little bit of reiteration, but not cover it all completely. Initially, best evidence we have of human history shows that spirituality and disease were very tightly interwoven, and that disease could be perceived as demonic influence, demonic possession, or as retribution for misdeeds. And in Assyria, it was common to have animal sacrifices done to investigate the livers of sheep or goats to predict what kind of course the disease would take and what someone would have to do to fix the disease. And this is actually a stone model of a liver that was used to predict and interpret the outcome of different sacrifices and what would happen to the person who was who was being diagnosed in that way. In Egypt, there was a great deal of practical pharmacy that was done, and the Smith-Ebers Papyrus here lists a lot of the medical knowledge that we know of from ancient Egypt. They did actually produce opium, alcohol, and had other things that they could do to dull the pain, had relatively broad range of drugs, some of which probably worked fairly well, some of which probably didn't work at all. And we do actually have written records of that pharmacy. Now that pharmacy was partially adapted by the Greeks who were living in Egypt and then moved back to Greece. But the Greeks also took the temples and the temple-based healing of Imhotep and translated it to the temples of Asclepius. But it wasn't until Hippocrates came along that the Greeks divorced spiritual judgment from health. And one thing that is explanatory for that is the Greek gods were not on par with the concept of the monotheistic gods of Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. The Greek gods were basically older siblings that might treat you well or might treat you poorly, and they really didn't care that much. So divorcing medicine from that sort of a spiritual basis really wasn't that big a step for them. And so the person who's credited with that is Hippocrates. Hippocrates was on the island of Kos, came up with the professional code of conduct for the physicians who trained under him, and his theory of medicine was based on the four humors. And if you had an excess of one humor, it could cause disease, and that you'd have to attack it through the opposites. If you had too much heat, you would attack that with a cold remedy or cold foods. And the makeup of the humors in your body at the time of birth determined your personality. You could be sanguine, have a lot of blood, you're pretty happy. There's somebody playing the lute, looks happy, right? You could be choleric, you could have too much bile, you could be angry all the time. So you substitute a sword for the guitar, and that's the difference between a sanguine personality and a choleric one. You could be melancholic, too much black bile. I like that the melancholic person is like got a Kleenex wrapped around his nose and he's reading a book. So melancholy, just think of Eeyore from Winnie the Pooh and you've got the right idea of what a melancholic personality is like. And then lastly, the phlegmatic personality, kind of slow, watery, kind of just tired. Those four basic personality types were associated with the four humors, and to fix an imbalance was to return the person to health. It was a humoral imbalance that created disease, and the body tried to fix it. If I had an imbalance of the humor, my body would create a fever to fix the problem. And the physician's job was to assist the body in getting through that point of crisis. And if the fever broke, you got better. If you died, your body was unable to handle the humoral imbalance that it was trying to attack. That was the Hippocratic concept of disease and a very basic way that the treatment was done. Now the next big name we talked about in the last session was Galen of Pergamon. Galen took this humoral theory and wedded it with the pneumatic theory of how the body moves, and essentially codified it and made it very authoritative. And as we mentioned last time, Galen's authority was unquestioned for about 1,300 years. Even though it wasn't based on anything that we would today consider to be scientific, the authoritative nature of it made people very, very unwilling to question it or try anything different. Now, classifying diseases and actually charting their progression seems like a no-brainer to us these days, trying to distinguish one disease from another, but this was really the first step in the practice of modern medicine and modern disease understanding, is actually figuring out what disease was what. And put yourself back in history for a little bit. If somebody has a fever, do you know what they've got? If someone's vomiting, do you know what they've got? A lot of different diseases have the same sort of presentations. And so it was very difficult for early physicians to actually figure out what diseases were present. And there were a lot of reasons that people gave for what caused these humoral imbalances in the first place. Was it bad air? Did you breathe in miasmatic or bad air? Was there some contagion going from person to person? It wasn't really well defined what it was, but people knew that disease did tend to spread through contact. Was it spiritual judgment? That was still something that people would think as a possible reason for illness. Did you have a humoral imbalance due to your native state or due to something about your job? And did your diet not help you out? You'll notice diet, not really that unusual. We think about dietary adjustments and dietary causes of disease to this day. So it's not that these people were ignorant, but they were working in a completely different mindset and framework than we are now. And it took a long time for people to develop the experimental instinct to question authority. So the first person who really brought that about was Andreas Vesalius, who noted and publicized several problems with the Galenic system. Now, Andreas Vesalius shared a few personal characteristics with Galen. He was very arrogant, he was very quick to anger, and when his colleagues in Padua really upset him through their constant interpretation that he was questioning the authority of Galen and therefore doing terrible work, he burned all of his notes and fled town and started working for the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. That didn't really work out so well either. But amongst those notes, there were rumored to be studies on diseased organs and how different diseases progressed and what the anatomical signs of those disease states would be. So we don't really know what Vesalius wrote about, but he did anticipate the people who were coming up and picking up on this experimental mindset. In Italy and France, we have the next set of people we can actually consider pseudo-pathologists, people who really started looking at the causes and understanding of disease. So Girolamo Frattacastro, this is great. He named the disease syphilis and accurately described it and its progression and how it goes. And if any of you want to replicate this feat, I would be super impressed. He described his findings in an epic poem. So if anybody here can decide not to publish in a respectable scientific journal, but instead type out a poem with a massive scientific advance in it, I will be beyond amazed. So his poem Syphilis was about a shepherd who angered Apollo, and Apollo therefore gave syphilis, the disease, syphilis. And he charted the course of the disease and actually described it and separated it from other diseases that people suffered from at the same time. Jean Fresnel in France was a physician who not only took his experience in the clinic, but took a lot of historical description of disease and how diseases were presented and codified them and came up with a system. And it's not really important that his system is inaccurate and unscientific by our current understanding, but the fact that he came up with a system at all really started people thinking about how diseases could be distinguished from each other and then treated. You can't treat something effectively until you actually know what it is you're trying to deal with. So his classification in his 3 books, Universia Medicina, broke diseases down and classified them as either specific or general. Specific disease would be something like a tumor. It was localized in a spot. Whereas a generalized disease would be something like fever. It affects multiple parts of the body. He then broke it down according to whether it occurred above the diaphragm, below the diaphragm, it occurred in the head, and he systematized it, and other people picked up that ball and kept on rolling with it. One of them in Italy was a guy named Marco Aurelio Severino, and he did a really intensive study on tumors and growths and swellings and trying to figure out how those not only progressed, but what their characteristics were. We can see a couple pictures from his book with tumors of the hand on the left. That's actually a hand. You can see a thumb sticking out right there. And over here we have a tumor growth on the head of an infant. Anybody who's been through Neuro 1, second years, I'm looking in your direction. Anybody want to take a stab at what we're looking at right there?
Meningeal.
Nice, meningeocele. 10 points to Gryffindor. Okay. We really do need to get houses here. Family medicine house, orthopedic house, anyhow. So these studies really picked up in France, Germany, Italy, and remember at this time, anatomy was being studied, dissections were being done, but they were on the bodies of criminals who had been sentenced to death and were then taken from the scaffold and dissected by either artists or by physicians and surgeons. And they had the exact opposite problem we have now. The people that they were studying were generally healthy, young, and lacking in any real disease states. And Marcus Aurelius Severino is actually quoted as saying that the examination of a single body of one who has died of some disease of long standing is of more service to medicine than the dissection of bodies of 10 men who have been hanged. So just take a moment and reflect on the fact it's actually nice that we have donors who had disease processes at work that we can investigate in the laboratory and actually see diseased organs and tumors and things of that nature, because historically didn't always have that luxury. Now, Franciscus Sylvius, responsible for the Sylvian fissure, along with a lot of other things, was an anatomist and pathologist in Italy. He was a really staunch proponent of the circulation of the blood. William Harvey's De Motu Cordis on the movement of the heart that brought blood circulation to our awareness really didn't make much of a splash initially, and it was only because people like Sylvius kept on insisting that the circulation of the blood took place in contrast to Galen's statement that it just kind of washed out from the liver and that was it. So he was very instrumental in putting forward our understanding of cardiovascular anatomy, but he's also the first person to apply chemistry to the study of medicine. At the University of Leiden, he actually worked in a chemical laboratory and came up with the radical idea that chemical processes were responsible for health and for disease. And his basis initially was that the alkalinization or acidification of tissues is what caused disease. Now, we know today your kidneys and your lungs do a pretty good job of keeping your pH in the normal level, but it is true that acidification or alkalization can kill you if it gets out of hand. So his theory wasn't right, but he was doing something really important by adding an understanding of chemistry to medicine. Now the next big step forward is also related to William Harvey. This is Marcello Malfigi, the first person to really bring microscopy to the study of medicine. And microscopy is going to become more and more important in the study of pathology. But he took Harvey's theory that arteries and veins were connected and actually found, in this picture, capillaries. Actually showed that there were physical connections between the arteries and veins, really nailing down the actual circulatory nature of the blood and making that far more stable. He did a lot of other studies under the microscope, as did Leeuwenhoek, Robert Hooke in England, and really kind of showed that the anatomy of structures microscopically was not just interesting, it was sometimes very surprising. Now, as this all was happening, people were starting to collect compendia of pathologic processes and pathologic states and diseases and their progression. The first big one has a really fantastic name, Sepulchridum sive anatomica practica ex cadaveribus morbo dentatus. Essentially, it's a collection of clinical correlations. It's a description of different diseases and how patients present and what problems they had that were discovered on necropsy after they died. It's a really interesting book. The problem is it's not very useful. It didn't really give people a guide as to how to find similar cases. It was just a big collection of cases, just strewn in any particular order, and it was very hard to pick up these 3 volumes and find something useful. So the next person, Giovanni Battista Morgagni, another Italian, was working in a hospital, and he got to see the patients come in, see how they presented, follow the course of their illness, and the hospital he worked at was standard practice to do necropsy after every death in the hospital. And so these autopsies were done. He found and described the pathologic processes that were present, and not only did he collect them in a very huge book. It's a really fantastic book, De Sedibus et Causibus Morborum, The Seats and Causes of Disease, but he came up with a comprehensive index. And unlike some of the other works, this book was an immediate smash when it was published because every physician could get a copy. Go to the index, my patient is nauseated, flip, flip, flip. Nausea, read through every case study related to nausea and get a sense of what happened when the person presented, how their disease went along, and what was actually present when they died. So it was a really big clinical help, but it was an even bigger help in that it started to cause people to question the theory of humoral imbalance. Because Morgagni didn't find excessive black bile. He didn't find that this person's leg had too much phlegm in it. He found that there were tumors and organs that were specifically damaged, and they didn't always affect other organs. The heart was damaged, and that was it. And this actually set up organic pathology, the idea that disease was caused by damage to specific organs. So it's the first real nail in the coffin of the humoral theory of imbalance, and brought in the idea that specific organs could be affected. I came across this t-shirt a while ago. I just thought that was hilarious. So now you too get the joke that's being referenced there. So, history keeps moving along, and we come to the French Revolution. And we haven't talked a great deal about France because not a whole lot was happening in the academic universities of France prior to this. Theology, law, and medicine were still being taught, but medicine hadn't really taken major steps forward in France. And it really was the French Revolution that opened up the academies, the medical practices, the hospitals to new ideas and new people, because the revolution kicked all the established people out of power and put new people in place. So the French Revolution had some good effect on French medicine and academia because it brought new people in and broke the rigid tradition that they'd been operating on before. Obviously, the French Revolution did some terrible things. Amongst them were the guillotining of some scientists. I think Antoine Lavoisier was guillotined, so his chemical work came to an abrupt halt because he was actually killed in the revolution. But it did allow France to become a little more innovative, and we'll see more and more French activity in the development of surgery and pathology as we go through a few more of these lectures. So in France, we've got Bichat, Marie-Françoise Xavier Bichat, and Jean Cronville. I'm terrible at French names. Jean Cronville started collecting case studies and examining the organs that were involved. And they took it one step further than Morgagni did. They said that they thought diseases didn't just affect organs, they affected specific tissues and organs. So one thing you're going to follow as we go through the rest of this talk is that the locations of disease start becoming defined as smaller and smaller and more discrete things. So we've moved from the whole body to organs. And because of the work in France, we moved to different tissues and organs. Here's a picture from Cuvillier's atlas, the first color atlas in pathology, by the way, showing pericarditis and how a specific tissue is affected, but other parts of the heart were not necessarily pathologic, just the pericardium. So, modern microbiology took a big step forward starting in England. And this guy, Edward Jenner, he noted something that was sort of an old wives' tale, that milkmaids never got smallpox. And he actually investigated that. Milkmaids tended to get cowpox, which causes some sores on the hand, but is almost invariably non-fatal. It's not a very virulent disease, as opposed to smallpox, which has up to 40% fatality, causes massive pustules and sloughing of skin in various cases as those pustules fuse and combine. And he decided to do an experiment, and he took a small child who was nearby and actually inoculated him with cowpox and then inoculated him with smallpox. Now that sounds worse than it is. For many years before this, people had tried to give themselves immunity to smallpox by taking crusts of smallpox and just kind of scratching the skin. They'd actually try to inoculate themselves against it. But what's the problem when you try to inoculate yourself against smallpox with smallpox? What happens sometimes? Sometimes you get a full-blown case of smallpox because there's still live bacteria there. Turns out that doing cowpox first conveyed total immunity from smallpox because of the similarity of the two organisms, but with much less likelihood of disease. And the reason we call vaccination vaccination is because vaca means cow, and they got these cowpox kind of little pustules to inoculate people against smallpox. So vaccination actually means inoculation from a cow. So Jenner was told by his friends and colleagues that he needed to take out a patent on this and make sure that it was all run centrally and that he could then become a very wealthy man. As opposed to a lot of the people we'll talk about in the history of medicine, he did the right thing and immediately published it and told people how they could inoculate against smallpox. And very quickly it became a disease that could be managed and is now the only disease that we've successfully wiped from the face of the earth, which, take a look at the picture on the right, probably a good thing. So, next up in England, we have Dr. John Snow. Oh, damn. Sorry, I forgot. This guy knows nothing. This guy knows some good stuff. So John Snow was a surgeon, but also obstetrician to Queen Victoria. But amongst the various interesting things he did, and we'll come back to him in subsequent talks, he was able to trace an outbreak of cholera in London. And of course, cholera was considered to be like any other disease. It was from some weird contagion. No one really knew how it spread. Maybe you had bad air. But he did the first modern epidemiological study and looked at where people were getting sick. And he figured out it was all clustered around a single water pump in Broad Street. Now, the heroic story is he went to Broad Street and removed the pump against the wishes of the law. Didn't really happen. He just told them to get rid of the pump and they closed it off. And the cholera epidemic subsided right away. And when they dug up the pump, they found that there was a sewer main that had broken nearby and was infecting the drinking water with fecal matter, which is how cholera spreads. So this is the first epidemiological study that was done and the first real public health success we can trace in the current era. Now in Austria, pathology started taking big steps forward because autopsy, very, very definite listing of disease states, processes, and how people progressed were made normal. It was something you did for every patient, and when they checked into the massive hospital in Austria, the Allgemeines Krankenhaus, their course of disease was charted, followed up in the dissecting room, and people learned a lot. The person who really got it started was this man, Karl Rokitansky, and he did a lot of good things. He came up with the idea that there was fluid between cells, and this intercellular milieu was actually responsible for a lot of the states of disease. The problem was his colleagues, especially a man we'll talk about in a moment called Virchow, thought that this smacked of the humoral theory and that it was old-fashioned and useless. So his findings were pretty much poo-pooed by everybody around him. Not really fair, but that's sometimes the way the cookie crumbles. But what did happen that was very unfortunate is the standard practice of dissection in the Allgemeines Krankenhaus set up a massive problem that was only dealt with a little bit later. Fun fact before we go any further, Karl Rokitansky is in fact the namesake and origin for Mad Max Rokitansky. George Miller, the director of the Mad Max movies, is actually a physician, and he financed the first Mad Max movie by doing extra shifts in the emergency department. So there you go. So and there's little medical trivia things kind of plastered throughout the Mad Max movies. So enjoy that. So in the hospital in Austria, in Vienna, a problem developed was that 18% of the women who came to the obstetric ward died. And they died of massive infections of the uterine tract called puerperal fever, childbirth fever. But next wing over, one wing over, same building, the mortality rate was 3%, and that was the wing staffed by the midwives. Now, nobody really saw this as a major problem, or at least they didn't really try to investigate it. They thought, well, there's a lake closer to the medical side, there's bad air that comes through that's causing the disease, there's nothing we can really do about it. And this man, Ignaz Semmelweis, a Hungarian who was living in Vienna, training as an obstetrician, thought that maybe there was something wrong that could be dealt with, because what happened was the medical residents would come to the hospital. First thing, they'd go down to the autopsy suite and dissect all the people who had died the night before. They would then go up to the obstetrics wards and go bed to bed doing pelvic examinations on the pregnant women there, and never washed their hands. And this is pre-gloves. There were no gloves. So they were basically spreading disease and a bacterial infection from woman to woman, and when they died of that infection and were dissected, the whole cycle started up again. That didn't happen on the midwife staffed ward. So Semmelweis instituted rigorous hand washing, and guess what? Plummeted to 3%, same rate as the midwife ward. So everything should be great, right? There's a problem. Semmelweis was a really poor communicator. He didn't feel confident speaking to people because he didn't grow up in Austria. He didn't feel like he really belonged. And he just kind of was obnoxiously, really pursued things strongly, but the minute somebody rebuffed him or kind of gave him any pushback, he just kind of dropped it. So if he'd stuck to his guns or been a little bit better at communicating, he might have been able to get these reforms enacted rigorously much sooner than they did. As it was, he left, and his colleagues who knew he was onto something had to wait until they were in a position of power to institute those same reforms, leading to many more years of the same problem that could have been avoided. So communication is important. Even if you're right, you still have to convince people that you're right. It's not enough to just be right. You have to keep at it until it works. Story goes that Semmelweis became senile. He actually developed dementia and was institutionalized, and they say that he actually died from sepsis from a cut similar to the disease he tried to save people from. The sad fact is, it's been shown through forensic investigation, he was actually beaten to death by the orderlies at the asylum where he was at because he was demented and hard to control, and this was the 1800s. So communication kept this advance from going further until people were actually able to institute it, because no one really believed in any sort of germ theory as yet. For that, we have to go a little bit further ahead, but we're going to jump back to cellular pathology and cellular investigation. Jacob Müller in Austria, again, was training people in how to conduct microscopic investigations of tissue in its normal state and compare that to the disease state. And he came up with the observation that tumors actually come from normal cells. Tumor cells are not something new. They're an aberration from an existing cell line. And he trained several people, trained Schwann. Does that name sound familiar? He's the guy who basically came up with the observation and pushed it through that animal tissues are made of cells. This was not something people really accepted before. And he knew that and was able to prove it because he got some support from his buddy Schleiden, who had proven that all plants come from cells. Now, Müller also trained this guy, his name's going to be familiar too, Henle, of the famous loop. And when we study histology, every time we talk about squamous and stratified and so forth, that terminology was codified and progressively used by Henle. So he's the one who kind of invented the language we use. And Müller also trained this guy, Rudolf Virchow. And honestly, this is not just for fun. I really don't even know where to start with Virchow. He comes up a lot. So let's go follow Virchow a little bit. Take a deep breath, because you are about to feel incredibly insignificant. At 22, he studied under Müller. 23, he became assistant prosector at the Charité Hospital. 24, he identified, described, and figured out what leukemia was. Then he graduated from medical school. Thereafter, he founded a journal strictly to have a forum to disperse all of his findings and all of his research. He needed his own journal just to do that. He wrote up a report about a typhus outbreak and how public sanitation could actually help Germany and Austria to have better health overall, because the typhus outbreak was due to massively poor sanitation. He was expelled from Berlin because he was a very, very vocal progressive and proponent of public health and public hygiene, and was basically kicked out of there because he was making too much noise and too much ruckus. But at 35, he was brought back as the new and first chair of pathology and director of Pathology Institute at the Charité Hospital. And at that point, he continued to do a great deal of work in pathology, describing many, many diseases, and you'll see lots of things with Virchow's name attached to them: Virchow's node, Virchow's triad, Virchow's triangle, and so forth. But not only was he involved in medicine and pathology, he's also published as many anthropology papers as medical papers. He was a massive proponent of public health, and it was his efforts when he got elected to the parliament in Germany that led to Berlin's sewer system becoming the best in Europe, where it had previously been amongst the worst. He made a lot of enemies in his progressive bid to make sanitation better, and Bismarck actually challenged him to a duel. There's two versions of what Virchow responded with. First version is that he said, "We can duel, but it must be with scalpels." And the second version was, "Okay, I will inject typhus into one sausage, and you will take a sausage and I will eat the other." Bismarck did not take him up on either response to the duel. And he was present when Troy was discovered. I just thought I'd throw that out there because what the hell. So Virchow did a lot of things. Amazing man. Oh, one last thing before I go. Let's see. We're good. So Virchow also did not like the anti-Semitic political parties and anti-Semitic groups that were operating in Germany and Austria at the time. And he did a study of Berlin school children that showed only 40% of Aryan school children actually had blonde hair and blue eyes. And he further showed that 14% of Jewish school children had blonde hair and blue eyes. And decades later, when Hitler came to power, he constantly and never lost an opportunity to just drag Virchow's name through the mud. So if Virchow wasn't amazing already, he made an enemy of Hitler like 40 years before Hitler even came to power. So just an amazing person. Didn't do everything good. We did a lot of good stuff. Now, Louis Pasteur took this study of microscopy and brought it together with microbiology for the first time. And Pasteur was brought in to examine, he was a chemist and used microscopy to examine the chirality of crystals and how they formed. But he was brought in to figure out why French wine was going rancid. The French wine industry was in a real bad place because a lot of wine was going rancid. And he figured out that the rancid wine had certain bacteria, well, we call them bacteria now, but they had certain little animalcules in them that were not present in good wine. Good wine had what we now call yeast. And he figured out that you could actually kill those bad particles but leave the good wine still drinkable, but kill off the little bacteria that were causing the problem. And that process, obviously, is pasteurization. So it was applied to the wine industry. He also saved the silkworm industry by figuring out that there was a bacterial infection affecting silkworms, and basically made microbiology not only approachable by doctors, but something that they would start looking for medical opportunities to apply it. And we'll see that in the history of surgery talk when microbiology was brought in to figure out why surgical sepsis occurred so frequently. Now, isolating and characterizing diseases took a big step forward with the microscope because you could actually look and see that some diseases had bacteria that looked one way and other diseases had a bacteria that looked another. And the first one that was really isolated and described this way, right here. Anybody want to know what Robert Koch was able to describe accurately? And what horrible disease that is? Also shares the name of the 1980s heavy metal band? Anthrax. That would be anthrax. So he was able to come up with a series of postulates that showed when you could ascribe the cause of a disease to a specific pathogen. Now we're going to switch gears a tiny bit and talk about another localized way that disease was conceptualized. The brain was considered to be this network of not even cells, but just this network of tissue that was initially thought to just cool the ventricles to keep them happy. Later on, people understood that the brain was important because damage to the head and injury to the brain caused neurologic problems. But the fact that regions of the brain had specific functions didn't really broach anyone's consciousness until Phineas Gage, a railway foreman, suffered a massively horrific injury. So they were drilling to blow out some rock to lay down new train tracks. One man drilled, next guy came in, poured gunpowder in, next guy put a cotton little wad down there, and then Phineas Gage came along with a tamping rod and would tap that down, and then they'd later set it off. Well, the guy with the cotton wad missed a hole. And Phineas Gage tapped, and his tamping rod shot through his jaw, through his skull, and that is his actual skull. It's in the Harvard Medical History Museum. And he survived without the infection killing him amazingly, and he didn't have any motor, memory, language, or sensory problems, but his personality completely changed. Whereas he used to be reliable and controlled, he was frequently out of control, used just foul language, said horrible things, and was unable to hold a job for a while. He eventually got a bit better and wound up as a stagecoach driver in Argentina, but this was the first time people realized that the area of the brain that was injured could actually cause a specific disease. If anyone hasn't got the sign-up sheets yet, go ahead and make sure you raise your hands and that other people can get those sign-up sheets to you. Localization of function then was followed up by Paul Broca, who found that his neurologic patients sometimes had specific injured regions in their brain. And Broca's area, right there, results in which one? Expressive or receptive aphasia. Expressive aphasia, they're unable to make language. His colleague, Carl Wernicke, discovered that a similar area, just a little more posterior, could cause receptive aphasia, the inability to understand language. This was a big change from the theory that the brain was this big network and didn't have any real localization. Then the microscope came in again. An Italian, Camillo Golgi, developed a silver stain that let him see the neurons for the first time. And his theory was that the neurons formed this complete network, that they were all absolutely interconnected and shared cytoplasm. However, a Spanish histologist, Ramon y Cajal, used Golgi's method and developed these amazingly intricate diagrams of neuronal circuitry. These were all hand-drawn by just silver staining the neurons and then following the axons and the dendrites. And he figured out that the axons met the dendrites and that there were actual separations between those. Those were the synapses, and they both shared a Nobel Prize for their investigation. First shared Nobel Prize. Now, American medicine got off to a good start in Philadelphia, but the Civil War just tanked everything. And we'll hit that again when we get to the surgery talk. But the Civil War just really took a lot of the infrastructure out of American life. The expense was tremendous. Thousands and thousands of young men were dead. There was a huge drop in people available to do the work. And American medicine became a massive backwater with lots of charlatans. People could open up a medical school for no reason at all, and you could just go practice. It was really up to the public's judgment whether they wanted your treatment or not. So way back then, the pharmacology was non-existent, and everybody just used whatever drugs they could. And cocaine, heroin, opium may not have cured anything, but it made people feel better, and it was sold in massive quantities. The big step forward in American medicine was the founding of the Johns Hopkins School, and it was endowed by Johns Hopkins, who was a railroad tycoon. But between his death and the founding of the school, his stocks had lost a lot of their value, and the school couldn't open until the wives and daughters of several of the board members said they would go and raise the funds if the board agreed to some outrageous demands. It was going to be a postgraduate course. Students actually had to have graduated college before going to medical school. Students had to speak and read German, French, Italian, and English to be able to actually check up with the current developments in Europe, which is where real progress was being made. The teaching hospital had to be associated with the school, and the medical faculty could not have a private practice. They had to practice at the medical school, and students had to be able to follow them on their rounds. And horribly, but not surprisingly, the most contentious issue of all is that women were to be accepted on the same basis as men. The board fought that off for a long time, but eventually they had to relent. They let the fundraising occur, and the Hopkins School of Medicine opened in 1893. Quick aside, the first school of osteopathy opened in 1892. And these were all the women in the first class out of the Kirksville School of Osteopathic Medicine. So, not only a year ahead, but even a little more progressive. And the osteopathic school didn't have pharmacology in the curriculum back then, but guess what? The pharmacology at the time was crap. So really not a bad idea. We'll go into why MD schools took preeminence over DO schools in just a minute. Now, pathology and microbiology at Johns Hopkins had a massively strong experimental basis. A lot of laboratory teaching was done, and the person responsible for that was William Welch. He recruited what are just the all-stars of medicine at that time. We'll talk more about several of them in an upcoming talk. But most of his students went on to become very heavily recruited for other medical schools. He trained 2 Nobel Prize laureates. He trained Walter Reed, who discovered that yellow fever and mosquitoes were spreading the disease in Panama. Simon Flexner, who we'll hear about in just a second. And he also was the first person to describe gas gangrene and the bacteria responsible for it, which was initially named after him against his wishes, but was later renamed Clostridium perfringens. Now, his student Simon Flexner was contacted by the Rockefeller Foundation to survey medical education in the United States. And he came back with the finding that everybody should be like Johns Hopkins. Now, these days, that would be a massive conflict of interests. But at the time, nobody really seemed to care. So the Rockefeller Foundation provided $50 million and said any school that would choose to adopt the Hopkins model could get some of that money to upgrade their facilities. And then the government came in and regulated basically that if you weren't following that model, you needed to go out of business. And so medical education became more uniform. There was better quality control. These proprietary schools were shut down. People actually had to know what they were talking about. Basic science and laboratory teaching and clinical practice were linked together for the first time. The frauds and charlatans and snake oil salesmen had a lot more difficulty competing against well-trained physicians in the United States. And the American Medical Association became the dominant voice of medicine. Now, that might not be so bad in and of itself, but the AMA used this voice to shut down competitors like midwives, osteopaths, and others. And that's one reason that MD practice had such an early bump, is that the MD schools were allowed to receive federal funding, but the DO schools were not until about the 1960s. And the number of MD schools was cut down massively to about 66, and the number of DO schools dropped from a much lower 8 to around 6. There's a question mark there because no one's really sure whether there were 6 or 5, if there was a combination of 2 at one point. So essentially, the funding was available for MD schools, but not for DO schools, which is one reason why DO schools had such a longer progression to get to the same level of accreditation. Now, we're almost there, but how has health and disease changed its concept in the last century? Molecular biology really had a 15-year amazing bump. Within 15 years, people figured out in 1940, George Bede and Edward Tatum, that protein structure was heritable and that genetic changes were localized in protein and protein structure and protein formation. Then it was shown that DNA was how things were inherited. That molecule, which was located in every cell, was actually where heritability resided. And then I'm sure you've heard that in 1953, James Watson and Francis Crick used data that they borrowed or stole, depending on which version of events you are listening to, X-ray diffraction data from Rosalind Franklin, and were able to deduce that DNA was a double spiral joined by base pairs, and that is how the code for genetic inheritability actually took place. And we're jumping ahead a bit, but in 1989, the first specific disease was tied to a single gene. Cystic fibrosis was tied to mutation in a specific gene. Now, many mutations in that gene can cause CF, but it was the first time an individual gene was localized as where a disease resulted. And the application of genetics and PCR, CRISPR, things like that, that's currently a massively important area of medical investigation. And within the next century, not even century, next few decades, there's going to be some amazing things that come from that. every time there's a new medical fad, it's going to cure everything, and it never does, but it does some good stuff along the way. So just keep your expectations medium whenever the next miracle cure comes around, because it might bring some good stuff, but it usually isn't quite as good as people make it out to be. All right, that's it for this talk. We're going to follow up next time with a history of pharmacopoeia, pharmacy, and interventions on how we make people healthy thereafter. Thank you.